It's hard to know who to trust in the media. So much is being thrown at us on a daily basis. To help me go through that, I have Emerald Robinson. Emerald, thank you so much for joining me again.
It's good to see you again, Stephen. Thanks for having me back.
Yes, our last video people enjoyed. We went deep on some topics, so I want to do the same thing here. For those of you who maybe don't know who Emerald is, she is an investigative journalist who's covering some of the most incredible stories. I'm going to put a link to your Twitter down below so that people can follow that. You know, you've talked about this, I've talked about this, but Democrats are flooding the United States with illegals in order to vote Democrat. I believe that's true, but Elon Musk retweeted something that made me look at it a little bit differently. He said perhaps they're flooding the United States in order to artificially inflate the numbers so that they can inject more ballots into the voting system. What are your thoughts on that?
That's absolutely right. Like, these people don't have to show up to vote. They just need to have a name to justify the infusion of ballots into the system. And it's really about, that's why we talk so much about voter rolls. And I think that it might not be the sexiest part to discuss about election fraud, right? Because when you get into machine hacking and you have a cyber expert actually hack into a machine in a courtroom, like happened in Georgia just a few months ago, he literally hacked it with his pen in Amy Totenberg's courtroom in Georgia. But it all relies on the dirty voter rolls in order to be able to to infuse the system with these ballots. So while he's a little bit late to the game, I'm glad that Elon Musk did speak up and highlight what is essentially the genesis that allows the rest of the fraud. Because look, I mean, Elon Musk has a big mic, and when he started talking about Georgia, which I've covered extensively, and in fact, there's a big meeting going on there today at the state election board, and we can get into that a little bit. I mean, it's ongoing right now. I'm watching it as we speak. It's actually running 2 hours behind because there's so much discussion that the board didn't want to discuss, but had to. Elon Musk tweeted a video out from the last meeting that the state election board in Georgia had, and it went Richter from there. And a lot of people who didn't know about the evidence that has been presented in Georgia and cannot be debunked found out about it because Elon Musk. So with him highlighting the voter rolls and the fact that the real strategy in bringing all these people into a country, I think it allows for a lot more. But yes, a major part of that is being able to pad the voter rolls and to have a name for these fake ballots.
Yeah. I had Garland Favorito on from Georgia. He's fantastic. I could listen to his accent all day, but you know,
he was speaking today.
Okay, yeah, he told me check back after the 10th. I'm going to be very busy, but I want to come back on the show and do an update. But you think about it, there were counties in Georgia where there were more ballots printed than there was population of the county. There were more votes that came back. There were more votes that came back than there was population. Yeah. And so you start thinking, wait a minute, there's only one party that doesn't want to clean up these voter rolls. That's the Democrats. There's only one party that wants to flood the nation and artificially inflate the number of names that they can send out. And of course, that's the Democrat Party. Since you brought up Georgia, Emerald, I wanted to ask you, you know, there was this big like gasp aha moment that I covered, and I'm sure you covered, where they reveal that 380,761 ballot images are missing from voting day. Do you believe that those never existed, or do you think that they wiped them off the server so that nobody would be able to use them as evidence if there was an audit? What are your thoughts on those missing ballot images?
I believe they never existed. And I'll tell you why. Because when you look at, and this is what is being debated today further in that state election board meeting, if you look at machine count 2 is what they call it, machine count 2, you're missing thousands of ballot images. Now, when they did the hand count on December 3rd and 4th in 2020, when they did the hand count, there was not enough ballots to match the machine count total, right? I think it was somewhere around 17,000 at that particular machine count. That's one machine, right? They have never found those ballot images. All they did was reconcile They didn't have a strategy for reconciling. You just had, I believe it was a Dominion official, say that they are reconciling this vote in emails or the count. They never, so that's why I say there was probably never the ballots there to start with. And I think when we're talking about 2024 and this influx of illegals and elections in the future, Democrats, they thought in the uniparty, I'll say, I don't think it's just Democrats, because they had a lot in the uniparty, the establishment, so-called Republicans. They finally found a common interest in rigging the elections. I believe, some Republicans have done it in the past as well, based on what I now know that I didn't know in November of 2020. I have learned so much, as have so many of us, right? We were not aware of the significant problems in our elections. They had a common cause in getting rid of Donald Trump. But going forward, but what I was getting at is that in 2020, it was still very hard to do. We use the phrase right now, too big to rig. Well, honestly, Stephen, it was too big to rig in 2020. And though they thought they had done enough to so-called fortify the election, as Molly Ball wrote about and used that word in a Time magazine piece, and I believe it was 2022 or late 2021, owning up to the fact that there was a well-coordinated effort to rig the election, they almost couldn't do it, because I believe Donald Trump has so many votes, it overwhelmed them even beyond their expectations, like he also did in 2016, right? They stepped up efforts, so they are well aware that they have to step up efforts ahead of 2024. And that means even more dirty voter rolls, more people on the dirty voter rolls, and more fake ballots.
Yeah. I was, and maybe something will change with this hearing that's happening today. I hope it does. But even after that gasp moment, a couple days later, they released a letter basically saying, we're not going to do anything except for keep an eye out on the next election. Like, why did they allow the cheating and not say, we're going to hold someone accountable? We're going to, maybe Biden stays in office, but for the history books, we are going to go back and correct the record that Donald Trump won the state of Georgia.
That's a very good question. I think it goes all the way to the top. What I have seen in reporting specifically on Georgia is that you might get someone in on, say, the state election board, and at first they seem promising and they're all gung-ho about solving the issue, but then there's obvious pressure applied. It seems to me that it's being applied not just from Raffensperger's office, but probably also Governor Brian Kemp. There's pressure applied to make sure that nothing is done. There's not any real action after investigation, or that the investigation results are downplayed, as we've seen with the last report that came out in May. Why? This is just speculation, Stephen. I think it gets back to probably the Bush election machine, right? And you have these establishment Republicans who also don't want to lose control, because in some ways they want to be able to rig it as they see fit. And I think if you look at the primary, we focus so much on the general elections, but in 2022, ahead of the midterms, I did a lot of focus on the primaries, and you could look at different states, Georgia, New Mexico, all across the union. You could see these, particularly with Republicans. I remember covering an audit in New Mexico. I think it was El Paso County, New Mexico. And they did an audit of their primary elections. And Stephen, it was the Republicans who had skewed numbers. It was the Republican candidates where the machine count did not match up to any kind of hand count they did, while the Democrats were pretty on the nose. So I think that even in the Republican Party, you have establishment figures that don't want to let go of control of the system in the way that they can manipulate it as well. We have a major problem in our country when it comes to elections, and it's not just related to Democrats.
Yeah. A good example of this might be someone like Mitch McConnell, right?
Yes.
I don't think Mitch McConnell gives two craps whether he's in control or whether he's in position number 2, because he still holds all the power of the party and the purse strings of the Senate. He didn't back Trump. He didn't back Trump candidates. He put almost no money behind them. Why? Because he doesn't care. He gets to retain power. I think Mitch McConnell is a great example of what you're discussing right now.
They want to lose. And you actually heard that from the horse's mouth in RNC, from the RNC after the 2020 election. when they really didn't step up to the plate on fighting for election integrity and trying to fix what happened in that election. And Liz Harrington, who was the spokeswoman at the time for the RNC, she did link an email that she'd received from a colleague who was Jonathan Reamer, I believe his name was. He was a lawyer, the lead counsel at the time. And he said, look, we raised more money in the opposition. They're all profiting off of the rigged system. And, you know, you mentioned Mitch McConnell. I've taken a look at Kentucky and I've talked to people there. I have not done as deep a dive as maybe I have into Georgia or Michigan or Wisconsin. But I would say that there should be some really close look into McConnell's elections. I don't think he's all that popular in Kentucky.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I wish that somebody would do a deep dive on all of these, but maybe Georgia will be, you know, where the dam breaks and our eyes will be open. I mean, my eyes are open, your eyes are open, but we need it to be big enough, you know, that the rest of America wakes up to this. Another thing, you probably saw this, but President Biden said that if by some magic or miracle Republicans are able to pass the SAVE Act, which would block anyone who isn't an American citizen from voting, that he will immediately veto that it's anti-American. Yeah. And he can't believe the Republicans would even put forward something like that. What are your thoughts on that? And then I have a follow-up question.
Well, I put this on X. They make it pretty obvious that they plan to cheat. They're not trying to hide the fact that they plan to cheat in the 2024 election. And I think that's why you see Biden not getting out, right? The problem that the Democrats have right now is not that they can't rig the election effectively and win, right? The problem they have is an optics problem, because at the end of the day, I don't think 2020 was believable. But you could kind of get by with it because of what had happened with COVID, right? And you could say, well, some people were unhappy about the lockdowns and they attribute that to Trump. But right now, there's such a groundswell of support for Donald Trump. It is very clear that there's no way in a real election Joe Biden would win. So at the end of the day, it's an optics game. They still have to kind of make it optically okay to pretend to everyone we still have a constitutional republic, which I would contend we don't at this point.
Yeah. But bringing all these illegals in, with that comes bankrupting our social safety net systems, our schools, our hospitals. It interrupts lower income families from being able to get an affordable apartment, an affordable condo, that first time house. How are Americans supposed to be able to compete with illegals sucking up so many resources?
Well, that they won't, right? And that's one reason you're seeing such a massive amount of support for Donald Trump within the minority community, right? Look, they're having Republican rallies in Chicago and getting large numbers of people pro-Trump rallies. Who would have thought that? But what these people realize is that the Democrats, who have long said they're in their corner and that Republicans hate them, they don't want to do anything for them. What this border invasion has finally done is it has pulled the wool off a lot of these people's eyes to say, hey, look, I'm sleeping outside, or I can't feed my children. I'm struggling to get a job, and they're giving illegals a phone. They're giving them transportation. They're setting them up in hotels and helping them find housing. And the resources that should have been allocated for, say, our nation's homeless are going to migrants, and they're throwing it in the faces of these disadvantaged people who had been told for decades Democrats care about them.
Well, you know, they've labeled themselves the party of kindness. I don't see it. I don't know who they're being kind to. It's certainly not their own voters, but their voters continue to vote them in. It's like there's a mental disconnect.
Well, maybe they do and maybe they don't. Steve, and I think that's what we're debating here, right? Is that how I don't think we know how corrupt our elections are. Now, yeah, sure, in some areas. I mean, look, but you go back way back. I mean, Chicago has always been sort of a cesspool of election rigging and fraud, right? When you looked at how mobsters rigged the elections there, and it kind of has continued. But I do think, yes, in a large part, a lot of those Chicago voters did vote in these Democrat people. But I'm not sure there's a true free and fair election that, given even the discontent that they're experiencing now, that they can vote these people out because it's rigged against them. So I agree that, yes, a lot of them do continue to vote for them, and we do see some of these influx. Like, look, I'm in an area where it is a blue area, but I'm in a red district, and unfortunately, we're seeing an influx of some of these, blue refugees from the DC metro area or New York or New Jersey, some even from California. And while they're not hard left, they are definitely changing even the fabric of my own district, because they do kind of still lean left, right? And they don't learn. So there is definitely some of that still goes on. But I do think there is so much discontent, and the inflation is so bad. When you hit people with their wallets and they can't, I'm in a very wealthy area. It amazes me. I can go sit at my country club and I can hear some of the wealthiest people complain about prices. And, I hear them, they're building, estates in the country club, and they're actually having to worry about their budget because supplies are so expensive. So you even have, the upper class now complaining that they can't afford what they want to afford, and they're worried and they're restricting their spending. So you imagine how the average middle class family feels. And I think that I think that if we could have free and fair elections, you would see the shift to more conservative or populist aligned politicians, even because when you look at the discontent, I mean, while there might not be as much agreement on some of the social issues, say like, hardcore conservatives and hardcore conservative, and some people might not agree on gay marriage. They do agree that they don't like our money going overseas, right, to Ukraine and going to these foreign wars, and they're against the forever wars. And they realize that both the Democrats and the Republicans are in bed and probably getting kickbacks from these forever wars, or at least they end up being lobbyists in the military industrial complex, or now it's the big pharma game, right? And how much big pharma is putting the thumb on the scale, and they can go off and be lobbyists to make a ton of money from big pharma. You're seeing a discontent from people on who both consider themselves, whether they consider themselves Democrat or Republican. So you're seeing more commonality, and people want to be free to live their lives the way they want and have the pursuit of happiness. And that's just getting harder and harder to do by the day with the kind of restrictions and corruption that we're seeing in our government. So I do believe that in free and fair elections, that there would be a shift to less government, more nationalism, whether some of these so-called Democrats would like to admit it or not. They would like to see more of a resources spent right here in America.
You brought up Chicago and the mob. It just reminded me, I've just been listening to this book about JFK, and how Joe Kennedy, JFK's father, absolutely rigged the election in Illinois. JFK would not have been president of the United States if his father had not made a backroom deal with the mob. And then, because JFK and RFK didn't know what daddy had done, they started going after the mob, and then boom, next thing you know, they're involved with the CIA and taking out a sitting president. Pretty wild stuff. But
young Bobby Kennedy didn't get the memo when he became Attorney General from daddy, right?
Yep. Yeah, they just thought it would they were saying in the book that he probably didn't tell them because Joe Kennedy had a stroke, and then basically had to live out the rest of his life in a wheelchair and unable to communicate. Meanwhile, the two Kennedy brothers, they're going after the mob, and the dad's in a wheelchair going, "Are you crazy? These are the people that got you elected." So anyway, interesting book. But you had mentioned, you've said the word uniparty a few times. I hear, the word rhino a lot. But I'm noticing, as I do more and more research, that it's almost like the Democrat Party, even though they have less voters, they're the ones in control of the government. And even under the umbrella of the Democrat Party are lots and lots of uniparty Republicans. They're not the Marjorie Taylor Greens that get a lot of attention. They're just these quiet Republicans that vote mainstream instead of conservative. Do you think I'm onto something there? Do you think that there's a lot of uniparty Republicans?
Well, yeah, absolutely. I think the majority are. Like, a lot of them will go on TV, and even if they're not as outspoken as, say, Marjorie Taylor Greene, they do go on TV and they do their sound bites. And I think it's more than people even realize. I think some of the people they think are very America first or conservative, diehard, constitutionalists, are not. They might vote a certain way, but at the end of the day, they don't really use the powers given to them in Congress to actually affect change, right? Or to actually do something about it. And I think that the strongest example of this, Stephen, is the fact that they continue to fund the FBI. They give them their whole wish list of what they want. The Department of Homeland Security. You had Andy Biggs, who is one of the good ones, one of the few good ones. I think there's like a handful. I think it's that low. That he introduced an amendment to cut back funding on Mayorkas's office. But they would put up a bigger fight every year when it came to reauthorize that massive omnibus spending bill, right? And while they'll complain and they'll go on TV and talk about, how this funds the Green New Deal, they're a part of it. They could have the courage to stand up and put their foot down and say, look, we're not funding this. We can close the government down. Yeah, they're going to get really bad press, but at the end of the day, how much longer can we exist like this as a country with the massive amount of spending that we're doing, and for priorities that most, with an extensive amount of priorities that most Americans aren't spending priorities that most Americans aren't on board with. So I would say a large number of them fall within that. And you say, well, why? Now, some of them I feel like did not. I think that a lot of them came to Congress with good intentions, right? I've seen this over and over because I covered DC for so many years, and they would come in and they'd have these really great campaigns and they'd be the insurgent candidate. They were going to go to Washington, DC and really, really make a difference. Well, they get there, they get caught up, they end up at some parties they should have just not went to, or they end up somewhere in a hotel room with somebody they should not have been there with. And they quickly change, and they're voting the way that the uniparty would want them to vote, or they're not quite being as effective, though they might still be vocally a bulldog. They're not quite as effective. So we have a real problem with our national security state, particularly our FBI running Congress. So a lot of the uniparty problems we have is really because they're controlled by the national security state.
Yeah. When Navalny over in Russia died, everybody blamed Putin. They've never connected it to Putin, but this idea that you jail your political opponent or make their life hell, we hear about that a lot, and yet from your own Twitter feed, they're trying to bankrupt Alex Jones and ruin his life. They've jailed Peter Navarro. They bankrupted Gateway Pundit, a conservative news outlet. They've jailed Steve Bannon. They're bankrupting Mayor Rudy Giuliani, and now they want to throw President Donald Trump in jail. Are they not just saying, democracy's on the line, but then they're behaving like Putin or Venezuela or some third world banana republic country?
Well, that's what they always do. And they've done that for a long time. It's just gotten even more egregious. They always use a word game to deflect from what they're actually doing. So from whatever they're crying about of the day, that's what they're actually doing. They're attacking our constitutional republic. And look, this isn't just happening just in our country. It's a global move against nationalism and populism. And I'm sure you covered on here the targeting of Jair Bolsonaro down in Brazil. I think they've maybe filed more charges of it late, trying to put him in jail, his political opponent Lula. Then you also have, I just saw today, and I have it flagged for reading later because I was getting ready to start my show. But Macron is now targeting Marine Le Pen, and it's on, what seems like trumped up charges of embezzlement misallocating campaign fraud. So he is also trying to do the same thing to Marine Le Pen that the Biden regime is doing to Donald Trump here. And when that creates a very scary situation. I think if you said, well, if it's just even our country, right, eventually perhaps with the guidance of, other countries around the world, perhaps we would course correct. But we were sort of the last week, and this is happening everywhere. So it is a global problem. We are in a battle against Marxism across the globe.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. Speaking of, wordplay and confusing people,
Semantics.
do you feel like Fox News is secretly anti-Trump? Like, I get the feeling
Is it a secret?
Well, they want the ratings and the revenue of Trump, but they don't want Trump himself.
Oh man, you know what they are trying to do lately? They are trying to now spin it as if they're a pro-Trump network again, which made me laugh, because it's really only how many months and days do we have left until Brett Baer calls Arizona early for Joe Biden or whoever they slide into Joe Biden's place? Look, Joe Biden might not make it to 2024, and that kind of doesn't even really matter because the election, because he's just a puppet, and Obama's the puppet master, and it will still be the same guidance. They'll just pick a different puppet. But yeah, I have to look who's running the decision desk. I assume it's still Arnold Mishkin, right? That was running it in 2020. They re-upped him for 2022 in the midterms. So Fox News is adamantly anti-Trump. And all of those anchors, they, maybe they're not full out Marxist, but I know, let's take, for instance, Brett Baer. He wants to be very chummy with all of these people in Washington, D.C. He wants to get invited to the parties. He wants to be, congratulated and fawned over whenever he goes anywhere. And it's very difficult for him. Actually, he can't take criticism in general. The guy, when I criticize him, he'll slide into my DMs and say, Emerald, that's not fair. And I can hear him crying about it. I can hear him, even though it's a Twitter DM. He's like, Emerald, that's just not very nice. And that's not very fair. His colleague, John Roberts, did the same thing to me, though he did it in the White House, in front of the rest of the White House press corps. And he was like, Emerald, that was not very collegial. And I'm like, well, I thought it was kind of sad you got on TV and cried while you were telling a lie. And it turns out the rest of the White House press corps didn't like him very much either. Not that I care what they think, because they're all, they're just a bunch of stenographers for the deep state. But no, Fox News, you're not even going to get to stick around Fox News if you're actually pro-Trump. If they find out you're really pro-Trump, you're going to be probably put on Laura Ingram's staff if they don't right out fire you, so that you're so miserable that, because that's what they do. They push people to Laura Ingram's staff and they get really miserable and they quit.
Oh, wow. Interesting.
I think she'd be the better show to work on myself.
Yeah, I wish I could see the inner workings, the behind the scenes for some of these news organizations, because
it's not just Fox.
Yeah, no, that's what I'm saying is we find out thanks to James O'Keefe that CNN is literally having a morning huddle every day on what can we discuss today to destroy Trump's reputation. It's like, I would have never guessed something like that was happening until James O'Keefe.
You didn't?
I didn't know. I'm new.
Well, it's worse than that, Stephen. I remember I was very new to covering Congress, and I think the year was like 2018. I think it was 2018. It was early in the year. It was ahead of the 2018 midterms. It's February, I believe, when the Republicans do their, winter retreat, and they talk about their messaging for the upcoming election cycle. And this happened to be at the Greenbrier in West Virginia. And I remember sitting there, and I literally was so new to covering Congress at the time. I wasn't well-versed in what everybody else did. I'm sitting there with, MSNBC, because I remember the Garrett guy sitting in front of me, CNN, the big six, plus all the other outlets, Washington Post. And it's like at 9 o'clock, everybody gets up and they leave the room, and they all come back with their talking points. And they all say, I was amazed, because I was standing in the middle doing my live shots, and you can hear the people to the right and left of you. They were literally saying the same thing, exactly the same verbiage. And then I realized, oh, everybody got their talking points. And then I later learned that, there is this memo essentially that goes out, and there are these calls in which they are given. Have you not? You've seen these montages, these mashups of what you can only describe as mockingbird media, literally using the same language over and over and over and over. Like, especially, I think it became most apparent to Americans during the so-called insurrection coverage, right? Where they use the very same phrases, and it was just over and over and over. And that is the very essence of propaganda, right?
Yeah. Well, I think the one right now that we're seeing is they're all parroting felon Trump, felon, 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 felon. You know, then I get on with his own lawyer, Will Scharf, and he's like, he's actually not even a felon. You can't call someone that till they go through sentencing. And then he has the appeals process. And so they're just grabbing what they think is going to embarrass him the most, and then throwing that in the media 24 hours a day. It's pretty disgusting what the media does to try to manipulate our minds.
And, you know, I'll tell you, I've seen my colleagues that work for the Big Six outside of a press conference one day. We're also, you know, waiting to go in to one of these presidential press conferences. Of course, this was during the Trump years. I only got to go to one during the Biden years. They made sure to keep me out. But they were standing there, and it was like Kristen Welker, you know, who now hosts Meet the Press on MSNBC, and Jim Acosta at CNN, and, you know, several other people from the other networks. But I remember those two specifically, and they're standing there coordinating questions with each other. Like, I'm going to ask this, and I'm going to ask that. And I've never stood there and thought, well, I'm going to talk to someone from a different outlet, and we're going to, you know, suggest what I ask or they ask. It was so bizarre to me. And it just, again, exemplified the kind of coordination that you have in the liberal media.
Yeah. Wow.
In some ways, I would say almost, even though it would almost be a good thing, because I do believe that the conservative ideas are the best ideas, though I'm not for like propaganda or mockingbird, but it would be kind of good if conservative media could have a closer and better relationship. I do feel like there's just not enough camaraderie possibly in the corporate media. I mean, excuse me, in the conservative media, whereas the liberals take it to that extreme, right? Where they're coordinating propaganda and how they're going to mislead the American people. I think there should be probably more camaraderie on the conservative side. So it's really nice when I get to come on and talk to someone like yourself. I think we should probably be talking and supporting each other a little bit more so that we could counter what has turned into a huge machine, right? There's no denying that even though there is no trust in the corporate media, they have built a machine, and it's going to take more of a concerted effort, a coordinated effort on the other side to bring back real journalism in support of one another.
Yeah, no, it is. Being a conservative journalist is not easy. I had Charlie Kirk on the other day, and he said to me off camera, "How do you have 1.5 million subscribers and I've never heard of you? I know everybody." I'm like, I've just been quietly putting out news, you know, like I don't go to conventions. I've never been invited to any of the political stuff. I just trying to educate people on what I think is truth. And he's like, all right, we need to get you introduced. Like you got to start collaborating with some of these people, you know? I'm like, yeah, I would love to do that. In the meantime, I'm just going to keep doing my show. And so, but yeah, it would be nice to see more of a concerted effort of conservatives to have each other's back. I know we're up against a wall. You've got a lot going on today. So my final question is, according to the Daily Mail, the White House photographer, Chandler West, is blowing the whistle. He says he can't be silent anymore. For months now, he's witnessed Joe Biden being unable to mentally deal with being president of the United States. He's falling asleep. He can't focus. He's saying it's time for Joe to go. What are your thoughts on that? And then does it even matter that people are finding out that Joe Biden has dementia, possibly Parkinson's, or do they just need him to be a meat stick so that they can, you know, plow through all of their pet projects?
Again, like I said, they have an optics problem right now because it has to be somewhat believable, though it hasn't been believable for a long time. The problem is Biden doesn't want to go. He's clearly worried, he and his family, Jill specifically, worried about the criminal exposure they might have. And then Mike McCormick, who was one of those people that worked in the staff, like the photographer, he's a stenographer. He was a stenographer right when Joe Biden was vice president, thinks that also, look, DC runs on blackmail. That is the reserve currency in DC.
He just put out that he believes that Joe
Biden
Biden is blackmailing Barack Obama.
I think that's a very, very strong possibility. So, also just with the rules, even though they don't adhere to the rules, it's a little bit hard, I think, to totally get rid of him. But they do have an optics problem. But here's the thing that is noteworthy. This photographer has been working in the White House for some time, yet he chooses to come forward now when there's obviously some kind of coordinated effort to get rid of Joe Biden. I can tell you, those people in the White House press corps, I sat with them for years. For I've watched them now for 3 years under the Biden regime. They never asked hard questions. They saw what I saw. I saw Joe Biden shuffle onto the North Lawn on January the 20th, 2021. He was a few feet away from me, and I wondered if he was going to make it to the front door. He was totally gassed then. And that was 2021. Stephen, I had Secret Service telling me he was messing himself and getting up in the middle of the night with no pants on to wander around the White House in 2021. So a lot of people have known for a long time. And I bet if you just posed those stenographers and the photographers and the housekeepers and the cleaners, you would know that everyone knew. It's just that now I would suspect it's Obama is saying it's okay to talk about it. And now you see the whistleblowers. Now you see the White House press corps asking questions. So I feel that Obama wants rid of him. Can he actually do it? That remains to be seen.
Yeah, we'll see. I do think he wants him out. He's publicly showing one face and then privately showing another. It would be interesting to know whether he has dirt on the Obamas. But thank you so much for coming on. Thank you for everything that you do. If people want to follow you online, Emerald, what's the best way to do that?
Well, you can always follow me on X at Emerald Robinson, but I say the best place to really follow me is on my Substack, because I go more in depth there with my investigative journalism, analysis, commentary, as well as, linking the source material, which I think a lot of people really like, especially in this day and age, right, where you can't trust a lot of journalists.
Yeah, I will put direct links to both of those down below. Thank you for taking time to come on my show. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
You too, Stephen. Thanks.